Hi, everybody, and welcome back to the Integral Podcast. I'm Naeem, and today we'll be talking about the endeavor of microfinance, panacea or poison pill. Microfinance was born through the experiments conducted by Muhammad Yunus in Bangladesh in the 70s. He held the idea that by providing people with capital, we allow them self-actualization opportunities and the ability to lift the floor in the village. He eventually won a Nobel Prize for his endeavors, and it was widely adopted by policymakers. However, does it do more harm than good? Consider two stories. Bui is an IT consultant in KZN. He earns 8,000 Rand per month, and he now owes 280,000 Rand in debt. He says by the fifth day of the month, he is completely bankrupt, and he has no hope of coming out of this predicament. Mama Ketty, on the other hand, borrowed 120,000 Rand to send her child to university. She says that she's giving him the opportunity that he would not otherwise have had. The dichotomy in stories exemplifies the divergent views on microfinance the world over. It is supposed to increase financial inclusion, but many people argue that it actually is a debt trap and a way into poverty. So today we are delighted to welcome Dr. Milford Bateman to the Integral Podcast. Dr. Bateman is a visiting professor of economics in the Faculty of Economics and Tourism at Juraj, Dobrila University of Pula. I hope I've pronounced that right. And he's an adjunct professor in international development study at St. Mary's University in Halifax, Canada. Dr. Bateman focuses his research on local economic development and microfinance, and he has authored many papers and books on the subject. Indeed, Dr. Bateman can be considered a world authority on microfinance, and we are certainly delighted to have him join us today. Dr. Bateman, thanks very much for joining us. Could you tell us and the listeners a bit more about yourself and how it is that you became interested in the topic of microfinance and economic development?
Well, it was a little bit indirectly. I was doing my PhD on small business development and local economic policy and focusing on Yugoslavia at the time, it was called, comparing it to models in Spain and Italy and the UK. And it was really only indirectly that I had a look at what was going on in microfinance because my supervisor said there was this new thing coming up he'd read about I should really have a look at. So I started to look a little bit about what was called microfinance, microcredit back then, and couldn't really understand it. I couldn't see how it was going to develop the local economy, and you have to develop the local economy in order to have sustainable poverty reduction. So that really got me interested in it a little bit. But it was really when I left and I went into consulting and academic research for the university when I got an academic position that I started to come across many microfinance programs in the field. In particular, I was working in Bosnia at the time, after the war, during the war and after the war, on the reconstruction aspect and looking at local development. And I couldn't see why they were moving into the idea of microfinance. I didn't think it was going to reconstruct the local economy. We had plenty of good models, such as the Marshall Plan that developed Western Europe after 1945, but yet institutions like the World Bank were absolutely dead set against those more, how to say, interventionist models, and they wanted this thing called microfinance. Even though most of the government people in this newly elected government didn't really want microfinance, they didn't want, because they were thinking, well, we'll be like Bangladesh, we want to be like Belgium. So I started to look a little bit more when I was a consultant, and every time I looked around in Bosnia, I could only see really negative things. I could see a lot more coffee bars, but no development. And eventually, through a contact friend at the University of Cambridge, Hajun Chang, I got offered a book contract, and so I took some time off and all the data I had and sat down and spent 6 months writing the book beginning in around 2008, 2009, once we got the project approved. And really, that set me off in a line of research that I really wasn't, it wasn't my plan to go into, but I started there.
Okay, excellent. That's quite a colorful story indeed. So Dr. Muhammad Yunus can be considered, and indeed, you know, he won a Nobel Prize for his work, and I think what he was trying to do was indeed very noble. But your research seems to indicate that, you know, despite the wholesale adoption of his entire philosophy by by policymakers that actually it creates barriers to poverty reduction and doesn't lead to sustainable growth. Can you explain why?
Well, I think where you start, and this is where I started with my PhD research, you have to start with successful models of local development. You look at Italy, for example, northern Italy, there's Germany, Spain, some Latin American economies, and then of course you have the East Asian miracle states. And when you look at those, you realize that microfinance has got nothing whatsoever to do with them. So that's the starting point. And then you look at what the problems that began to emerge. And I mean, I think there are lots of problems, I've written about them, but I think it boils down to a couple. Now, the first thing I think what Muhammad Yunus misunderstood completely was that the poverty is more about, it's a demand issue. It's not so much a supply issue. And what I mean by that is that in the 1970s, a lot of researchers were looking at Africa, Asia, Latin America, and what was happening in these poorest communities. Well, they discovered something called the informal sector. And they realized these are small, not registered, tiny little, what we would call micro enterprises. And these were all over the place. And what they realized was that these micro enterprises were pretty much all struggling to make a living. Long hours, hard work, dangerous work, unregistered, paying no tax, whatever. So that was what they found people go into when they can't get a better job. And what Muhammad Yunus did when he came along was to say, look, we can't, capitalism doesn't provide the poor with a job, but what we can do is cram them all into the informal sector with the help of a microcredit. And of course, that's exactly what microcredit does. It expands the informal sector. And when you expand the informal sector with no additional demand, basically lots of bad things happen. So you have 10 coffee bars in the street, and in a year or so you have 40 coffee bars, but they're basically sharing the demand between them. Prices inevitably go down. So you have an already overcrowded sector in the 1970s, massively overcrowded by the 2000s. And of course, incomes tend to go down, and there's no real sustainable development as a result of that. So Yunus basically misunderstood poverty. I think the other issue that came out of it is when a lot of microfinance institutions realized that the poor could no longer absorb any more microcredit because they realized that starting a coffee bar, they wouldn't make any money. They were more likely to lose money. The poor started to take microcredit out for consumption lending. And as you know, in South Africa, it's a big dynamic, and it became the accepted case all over. And of course, that leads on to the next problem, which is mass over-indebtedness. Now, again, I don't need to tell you about that in South Africa, but we see it everywhere. And so that basically putting the poor into debt is, again, it's not the way to do it. And if you look at South Africa and Africa as a whole, there are more people in the informal sector than anywhere else on the planet, but there are also more people over-indebted probably than anywhere else on the planet. So it's not the way, putting people in debt, particularly for consumption lending, is not the way forward. And so I go back to what I said earlier. There are no examples of successful local development arising through the provision of small-scale credit. When you look at the successful examples, they all were in the area of providing formal microcredit, formal small or medium enterprises. There's a very close correlation between successful local development and enterprises that are mainly in the small to medium sized category, formalized, using some technology, training their workers, paying taxes, etc., etc. So those are the sorts of businesses that create a successful local economy, not adding to the supply of coffee bars, shuttle traders, fast food. If it was, Africa would probably would be the most successful country on the planet because it has a surplus of exactly those types of businesses. But in actual fact, that's the reason why it's probably the poorest continent. Now, just on the end, I mean, we can't blame a lot of the problems that arose later on were because of the commercialization of microcredit. In other words, because of the World Bank and because of the microcredit advocacy community, it was turned into a business, a for-profit business. And it was really since then that it became a real problem. As we saw in the global financial crisis, a lot of the idea that you basically turn everything into a profit-making venture, well, you realize that that brings in the sort of Wall Street style ideology and greed and motivations. So it was inevitable that it was going to destroy what was possibly, you know, not doing too much damage, but when it was commercialized, that's really when the damage came in. And it was because the people, the advocacy community behind that were very naive in thinking that the way that the textbooks are written about how markets work and private sector incentives, they actually believe that that's what happens in real life. And we know, if we didn't before, that after 2008, the textbooks say one thing, because the textbooks, a lot of them are ideology, but in actual fact, real life is completely different. And it was, in a sense, more to do with that community of advocates that we ended up with a disaster that we have today, where microcredit really doesn't work. In fact, it sets back most communities.
No, but that seems like quite I mean, it's a cogent and quite an easy to follow argument. Would you say then that policymakers are seduced by the idea of, or the allure of microfinance, and seduced by the idea of financial inclusion, that they are ignoring the data and ignoring what the real world experience is? Because these experiences that you talk about are not necessarily very recent.
Well, I think what's been, I mean, certainly since around the damage that has been done, if you like, associated with microcredit, really took on a new level after around 2010, 2011, because when it was turned into a for-profit business, you had a lot of investors piling in, hoping to make money. So you had an incentive to growth, and growth under no regulation, because the World Bank and others like self-regulation, basically always leads on to reckless lending. As we saw in 2008 or before in the global financial crisis, when the reckless lending was mainly associated with subprime mortgages, we here have reckless lending with regard to microcredit. So as much microcredit must be pushed out of the door as possible. Now, when it was clear that microcredit wasn't working, it became clear to the World Bank around 2010, 11, or even maybe before, they didn't want to get rid of it for two reasons. One, ideologically, it's exactly what they want, because microcredit underpins micro-enterprise, individual entrepreneurship, which is a huge part of what we might call capitalism. So for that reason, we cannot discredit microcredit because it supports individual capitalism. The second reason is that because it makes a lot of people were making a hell of a lot of money. And of course, the World Bank represents the financial elite. So for that reason, there's no way they could phase out microcredit. So they needed a new rationale, a new goal. And that's where this thing called financial inclusion came in. No evidence that it will work, no evidence that microcredit worked, but it's a new justification that they could, with a straight face, say, we're trying to promote financial inclusion because we have the interests of the global poor at heart. And if we can only get everybody included in the financial system, you will see an economic miracle. It was complete nonsense, but it served the purpose of justifying and validating microcredit in the eyes of policymakers and governments in developing countries. So they could say, well, if the World Bank says we need to push for financial inclusion and they say it will work, then that's what we've got to do. And even though there wasn't any actual data, and in fact, all the microcredit advocates people like Jonathan Morduck, David Rudman, were now actually saying, well, you know what? The data actually says there's no impact. So it's a huge industry, financed by the World Bank and by many, many others, but there's actually no impact. So what the hell are we doing it for? So that really created a problem. And so there's constant looking for new goals to say, well, this is why we're doing it. Financial inclusion, the last mile, bringing everybody into the financial system. But it's basically just trying to find a new goal to cover up for a failed project.
Milford, you made some great points there. I mean, I think that some of the things that I think myself as an investment manager really struggles with, your points about capitalism, individual responsibility, but somehow in the case of microfinance, and I think I see it the same in healthcare industries. There's sort of some forms of economic activity, we can call it that, where it's not a fair decision. So what I found is, when someone's going to take a small loan, it's not, and this is the case of South Africa, and I'd like to know your thoughts. It's not just about wanting to start a business. As you said, it might be for consumption. And in that case, it's in order to survive. So you're not making a fair sort of choice to say, well, I'm choosing to borrow this money. I understand what the interest is and the consequences afterwards. But if your choice is, I need this money in order to buy food for my family, that in itself, creates the problem. What's your thinking around, that sort of economics and what it does to societies?
Well, I mean, I think there's a lot of research around this idea that, the macroeconomy, I mean, one of the problems in 2008 that was exposed was that everybody basically is becoming hooked on the idea of debt. Okay, I mean, in the macroeconomy, we have seen wage stagnation since the 1970s, but we haven't seen, and yet we have inequality has risen to massive, a massive level. But in a sense, we don't have a pushback. We don't have a revolution. How is it that the wages of the majority are not going anywhere? We have massive inequality. How do we square that circle? Well, as one guy wrote in the Financial Times once, a great article, the dirty little secret is debt. And so if your wages are not going up, you start to become addicted to your credit card. You start to pay your kids' university fees with debt. You start to buy your car on debt. Everything becomes about debt. So you financialize the system. Everybody's included now. And if the wages are not going up, you say, well, look, take a loan. So that's the macro, and we knew that was happening, and the results were the 2008 crisis when people couldn't take out any more debt. But at the local level, and particularly in the global south, we see the same thing. The economy is not producing the jobs that we need. The state is not getting involved in order to at least try to provide a minimum safety net, to develop the sort of businesses that we need. So what they're saying to the poor is basically, hey, take a microloan. You're on your own. Do something. And what they then do is the 2 or 3% that actually might do something with it are then paraded as the success stories on all the websites, and all the media gets onto them. And it's a way of saying, look, going into debt will work. Just don't blame capitalism or the economy or your government, because, it's really what you have to do. You just didn't work hard enough. I've seen this myself. I did a lot of work in Colombia. And one of the reasons they liked microcredit in Colombia was, at least the elites liked it, was because they could say to the poor that, if you're complaining about your poverty, but you have this lovely thing called microcredit. If you don't want to use it, then maybe you actually like being in poverty. Maybe it's your fault. You just don't want to work hard enough. In actual fact, they realized that trying to set up a business as a hamburger stall, or buying and selling SIM cards on the street, or another grocery shop, you can't make any money. And so that's why you take more lending out, you borrow more money because you need to at least survive to the end of the month, hoping that something will come your way. But as we see, you end up in more and more debt. A short way out of it is you lose some of your assets, but long term, you know, it's not actually very good for you. But that's the way we're heading. We needed something that the poor can think, well, you know, maybe the system isn't that bad because I at least can get into debt and I can buy some things. Okay, I'm not going to think about what's going to happen in a year or whatever. I just need to feed my family today. It's a short-term solution. It's not a long-term solution to the problems that we're heading into, certainly since the 1970s.
You've touched on some interesting points there that I wanted to raise, but I think you've answered my next question, which was going to be that, you know, a lot of these microfinanciers will say that access to credit and just a means to create something will ignite the entrepreneurial spirit within the poor and thus allow them to actually lift themselves from poverty, and it will increase the flow in entire villages and communities. But it seems to me that your research indicates this is the exception and not the rule. You said 2 to 3%, and the rest will squander. Is that your view? Is that correct?
Well, look, I mean, I wouldn't use the word squander, but I mean, I think, as I said, the local economies, even in the 1970s, were pretty much well supplied by people providing fast food or goods and services or whatever. The problem was people didn't have the money to buy those things. And so if you say, right, we need to get people out of poverty, so why not turn them all into individual entrepreneurs? So it sounds on the face of it good. But it's a little bit like saying to somebody, look, I mean, why don't you play the lottery? Because I have seen somebody up the street who played the lottery and they won first prize. So if you don't want to play the lottery, maybe it's because you're lazy, you don't want to buy your lottery ticket. But when you actually look at the economics of it, the lottery is a great system for tiny 0.05% to win. The rest of them lose their money. And it's not coincidental, the only people who win from lotteries are the people who manage them. But the sort of logic is very similar to microcredit. Only a small amount of people in microcredit actually do very well. Most of them are adding to the supply of things in the local community that are already adequately supplied, and the people already supplying them are angry because they're not making any money. Look, I mean, when it really came to me was in Colombia, when we were working in Medellin, in a very difficult neighborhood. We went up into one of the favelas, and we had a look at one street in particular that our friends wanted us to see from the university there. And on one side of the street, I mean, not quite exactly, but on one side of the street, you might say those were the guys who were there 20 years with fast food or with just a stall selling exactly the same things. So you had 30 or 40 up the street. But on the other side of the street, you had the people who were displaced in the rural communities, had no job, and so this thing called microcredit was going to get them out of it, and so they came on, and they set up on the other side of the street, trying to sell the same things. So when we talked to the people who are just newbies, who just came in, they said, well, you know, they told us we would make a living, but, you know, we're working 15 hours a day. We sell maybe $20 of shampoo and beer and toothpaste. And, you know, I mean, it's better than nothing, but it's not, you know, we're losing and it's very difficult. So when you walk over the other side of the street, you talk to the guys who've been there 20 years. So they say, how is it? Well, it's terrible. It's terrible. And it's those guys over there. We used to make a little bit of a living. We used to be able to sell a few things. These guys come along, we can't sell anything. I'm working 15 hours a day for selling $15 worth of beer or shampoo. It's a tragedy. We're paying for their jobs. Why are we were already struggling. So you have to realize that the local economy isn't something that you can supply everything and then everything will be bought. I mean, Muhammad Yunus made a big error. He looked at his village and said he saw some women selling baskets. And he said, you know, this woman, he helped her sell more baskets because he gave her a loan which she paid back instead of going to the moneylender. And he said, well, if everybody in the town can sell baskets, then there will be no more poverty. Now you can see the logic is completely wrong, because who's going to buy all those baskets? And it's the same everywhere. Everywhere you go, in the Balkans here, in Latin America, when I've been elsewhere in Asia, the problem with most people is, do you know what I can do that I can sell? Do you know where I can buy? I can find something that people want. So because of technology and because of population, people are providing just about everything. But there's nobody really, because of incomes are not going anywhere, nobody is actually buying what it is. That's why governments and others have to move towards developing those businesses that have growth potential, that have a possibility to maybe not just sell locally, but sell internationally. If you don't do that, then you're basically trapped in a local economy where everybody's trying to sell to everybody else in poverty. And of course, you're not going anywhere. And of course, that, in a sense, in a nutshell, is the African experience, sadly.
Sure. That is incredible, Milford. I think, I mean, it's amazing what a sort of perversion of what seemed to be good intent has resulted in such disaster. I just wanted to know, because I know you know the South African case very well. I've read a number of your articles on South Africa, but what I find particularly, I would say, almost heinous, is in South Africa we've got a different situation where the poor who can qualify for the loans actually, you know, obviously they not obviously, but the credit regulator requires them to have jobs. Many of these poor individuals actually contribute and save towards the pension scheme already. This pension scheme gives them, you know, tax benefits in the form that your benefits are tax shields. But at the same time, because they don't have access to those funds, they then have to go and borrow from unsecured lenders or microcredit. So you've got this strange situation where, you know, under the good intentions of making people able to save, you're holding back capital from them, forcing them to go out and borrow somewhere else. And here's the most perverse part about this, and myself and Naeem and the other guys in the team have always highlighted this, is that the funders of these loans end up being mostly the pension funds themselves. So it's strange. It's me, Vincent, a poor guy. I have to save, and I supposedly get some tax breaks, and I'm going to get maybe 7% after tax return, or tax shielded returns, and I end up paying interest of 30%. I mean, have you ever seen such a situation globally? For me, this is perverse, I would say, what's happening here.
Well, I mean, South Africa is a strange country because of its past. I think when the government came in, they had ideas about more of a social economy, a social welfare approach. I mean, this was back in the ANC Charter from the 1950s. For whatever reason, all those plans for development banks and more social welfare type approach were abandoned. We won't know why Mandela agreed to it, and then South Africa, in a sense, went into a bit of a free fall after that. I mean, we think it has something to do with the World Bank pressure on them. So I think, I mean, I don't know the specificities of all the pensions and how it is, but I think the idea that people should be saving for their pension, I think is something. I mean, I wouldn't go on to the sort of American model where you have your 501k because you have a very bit of a disconnect at the moment, because the stock market there is going gangbusters, and so poor people are supporting a government that really doesn't work for them because their 501k is doing very well. And that's the whole reason you give them a private pension, in order that it's tied to the stock market, in order that they will do things, or they'll agree to cozying up to the corporate sector in order that your pension it gives them a stake, in a sense, in elite capitalism, if you like. So I don't know whether that's what's going on in South Africa, but it does make very little sense that you save for your pension and then you get, as you say, 7%, but then you're taking out a loan to fund a business at a huge amount of money. I mean, interest rate, that's crazy. I mean, I don't like the 501k, but what they do allow you to do with a 501k is you can take some of your money out of your 501k. A lot of people I know take the 501k out because they want to start a business, and they're allowed to do that. And then they put them, obviously they don't earn any interest out or any when they take it out, but then they can put it back at a later stage. If there was something like that, I think that's a possibility. But the difference is, I think in the States, is that you take it out, usually you take out a fair big sum of money and you want to set up a proper business. Now, a lot of them fail. There's a huge failure rate, which we always ignore, or rather certain economists ignore. But I think in places like South Africa, it's a huge risk if you start taking out, you know, you don't save, if that's the only way, if there is no state pension. It's a huge risk you do that, to set up businesses where the chances of success are so infinitesimally small that, you know, it really is, going back to the lottery analogy, it really is like, you know, winning the lottery if you decide to take money out from your pension and use it to set up a business. I mean, that's the way to really a very, very bad ending if you start doing that. But I think it all goes back also to the idea that somehow our only way, excuse me, to survive is by individual entrepreneurship. I mean, that isn't how other countries succeeded. They succeeded through a combination state enterprises, of big enterprises funded partly by the state and in cooperation with the state, small and medium enterprises, privately owned, but helped and hiring people as employees at good wage rates with trade unions, etc., etc. I mean, that model, not perfect, but that model seems to produce more than saying to everybody, look, you're in poverty, go out, take wherever you get the money from, whether it's you don't put into your pension fund or you take it from the bank or whatever, go out and make your life as an individual micro-entrepreneur. I think we now realize after 30 years, and as I say, in several of the latest sort of publications, even the advocates who maybe 10 years ago I was arguing with, they now admit that there is no perceived, there is no identifiable benefit from microcredit, from engaging in it. The only benefit is on the part of the suppliers, not the part of the recipient. So I think that once you invert that, once you say we're going to support the poor, and when you invert that around 1990 and say we're going to commercialize it, and it becomes the suppliers of microcredit who are the ones really making the money, I think that's when you realize that the whole idea was founded on false logic. I think that's the only way you can describe it. I think from the point of view of investment companies, now I think they're necessary, but I think other countries have been able to regulate their investment companies so that they want them to channel their funding into more sustainable businesses. I mean, this is what I've been talking when I talk about, you know, write about the role of investment. That, you know, and the problem is that investing in sustainable SMEs is one, low return compared to microcredit, and two, it's high risk. You know, it's a difficult market to be in. So that's why a lot of investment providers have moved out of that. When you can make 40% interest rates and you can make 30% rate of return on microcredit, why are you going to mess about with SMEs? Why are you going to support them, even new starts or even expansions, when you can make so much money there? I mean, the Inter-American Development Bank did a great book called The Age of Productivity in 2010, and they looked at how the investment climate was changing in Latin America over the 1980s, and how financial intermediation was changing. And they said, look, investors have now switched. They're no longer willing to, okay, with a little bit of pressure from government, but they are no longer as willing to invest in sustainable SMEs, formally owned, bit of technology, training the workers, you know, the recipe for success. They're no longer willing, and we're not regulating them and pushing them because the returns are simply not there. Why are you going to mess around with 5% returns when if you put your money into microcredit, either directly or through a bank which on-lends to microcredit institutions? I mean, I was looking at ones in Latin America. They were getting a 10% guaranteed no-risk rate of return, and the MFI was then on lending. Why are they going to bother with the businesses that create the wealth when you can make that sort of money? And so that's a problem that we have to deal with now. How do we restructure the financial intermediation sector so that we shift society's financial resources into the businesses that we know from past experience create the wealth, create the businesses that will succeed? It's a difficult question.
No, you make excellent points around what our role as investment companies are, and I think, you know, you hit the nail on the head when you say that we need to invest in a more sustainable way. I think possibly South Africa is one of the more insidious examples of microfinance gone wrong. You're absolutely right that from the 90s, you know, what was needed was financial inclusion and democratization of the financial economy. And what you had was a profit motive take grip from day one. And essentially all that's happened is these microfinance companies have made a lot of money, and as Vincent said, you know, it's people who are employed that get these loans. But having said that, we've had a bank failure every 2 years on average, so there have been many casualties along the way. But if you look at our statistics, you know, I think 1/3 of these loans go to people who earn less than $300 a month. 82% go to people who earn less than $1,000 a month, and remember, all of these people have jobs. I mean, it bears very little resemblance to what Mohammed Yunus was trying to do anyway. And, you know, 56% of people are in default. This is not financial inclusion to the extent that these people can then migrate up the credit curve into something that's quote unquote more constructive. And the way we view it is, if you invest in companies that do this to a consumer, essentially you are entrenching their share of wallet over time. And you are then doing so to the detriment of all other investments in your portfolio, because these consumers are now encumbered by these loans forever and a day, because it turns out to be just some kind of a debt trap. But would you agree with the comment that South Africa is one of the worst cases of microfinance through the countries that you've researched?
Yes, I mean, I would say it's certainly up there in the top 5 worst examples. I mean, in 1994, you had the World Bank and others coming in. The solution for the poor, for the black majority, was microcredit. And no amount of argument against that by people I know was able to persuade the World Bank, because the World Bank held the key, the purse strings for much bigger loans for all sorts of restructuring. And so that was what was offered. You can get $300, make a go of it. That's all you're going to get. So obviously that turned into a disaster for the black community in particular, but for the white community, the narrow white community owning the big banks, it was fantastic. And if you look at I'm not going to name names, but if you look at the people who were middle managers in 2000s, by the early 2000s, they were on South Africa's 100 richest list. And if that doesn't tell you about the motive and about the way that the microcredit industry was evolving to serve the majority, to, in a sense, take the wealth from them in order to siphon it up to the top, I don't know what does. I mean, I think there are some that don't like to think that they are part of the majority. Small Enterprise Foundation was going just before apartheid collapsed, but they're still part of the whole system in the sense that they are offering a solution that doesn't work. And even though they are non-profit, or they don't take They don't really take that much out of the business. They're not actually contributing to anything. Simply being repaid is not an achievement, giving your money out and getting the money back. You mentioned also the investment. I mean, I think there is a change since about 2008. A lot of companies, and possibly yours is the same, are moving into the ethical space. They realize the problems. I mean, we've seen this in Italy with some banks and some investment houses, impact investing. I don't believe in a lot of this, but I think there are some genuine examples of companies that realize that they want to make a return for their investors, but it's not going to be a crazily high return, but they also want to make a real impact and not a fake impact that they cover up with statistics, with fake statistics. And so, I mean, that is one thing that I think is a positive development, that we are seeing more people challenging the microcredit model and the Wall Street model and saying, well, we want to set up an ethical investment bank, like Banca Etica in Italy, or ethical investors. I'm not always convinced by them. I've been looking at some in Cambodia that claim to be social impact investors. I mean, it's complete whitewash. But I have come across others that I think are ethical investors. So there is some good news that people are now beginning to realize, and maybe COVID-19 is also one of the things that will spur people on to wanting to invest ethically, but get some sort of a return. If you want to make 20% a return, fine, go to a microfinance institution, destroy the local economy, but you'll get your 20%. I see this in Cambodia today, maybe in South Africa. But if you want to make, I don't know, 2 or 3% and help the local economy, then there's a different way of doing it. I mean, a lot of people are coming out with different models of investing. So there is a little bit of light at the end of the tunnel.
Thanks, Milford. I think those are great points and suggestions. I just wanted to turn your attention towards, let's call it the more regulatory approach. So, one of the things that you can do now, I suppose, when you're a South Africa, or you mentioned, other sort of emerging countries, one approach we've taken is to start trying to cap the interest rates, and that starts a debate of how low is low, because now we've got an interesting situation where our sort of reference rate, or the bank rate, has dropped substantially, but these unsecured loans, because they're fixed in nature, you're still stuck on these very high interest rates. So that's approach number one. Or two, do you actually just go out and ban these altogether if they're causing that much of a problem? I just wanted to understand how should regulators approach this?
Well, I think since the microcredit model emerged in the 1980s and 90s, particularly under World Bank pressure, there has been, and it was also part of the overall ideology of what we call neoliberalism, was this idea that the only way to regulate was to self-regulate. So pass the responsibility onto the institutions themselves. Now that ideology blew up in 2008, and as even Alan Greenspan, the Fed governor, realized when he said at the famous congressional committee, my ideology was wrong. I assumed that if we gave the responsibility to the banks, that they would regulate in the interests of the client. And they regulated in the interests of the managers and the CEOs and the shareholders, not the clients. And I think that logic is now, in a sense, we found that it was wrong in microcredit as well. This push for self-regulation is basically no regulation. That's why you have all the scandals in Mexico with Banco Compartamos, with M-Pesa in Kenya with the huge profits and the over-indebtedness, Cambodia. So I think you've got to have sensible regulation of an industry, and particularly of the current industry. I think long term, you can't regulate that doesn't want to be regulated. And the problem with that is that when you have people, narrow elites, in control of these institutions, they don't have the public interest in mind. We know they have their own interests in mind. It's very difficult to regulate those people. You mentioned the interest rate cap. Well, they tried it on in Cambodia. interest rates were very high. The MFIs were making huge amounts of money, so they had an 18% interest rate cap in 2017 to slow the market down. What actually happened was that because all the MFIs knew how to get around it, they charged fees, document fees, initiation fees, and when you took the whole package together, the actual interest rate, the real interest rate, was higher than it was before. And growth went up 45% in 2018 when it was supposed to slow down. So trying to regulate and monitor these guys, they are savvy. They have all the best MBAs from Harvard who know how to get around government, and the regulators are ill-equipped, they're underfinanced. I think what it boils down to is that if you can't change, if the beast cannot be changed, you have to get rid of the beast. And a lot of what the work I'm doing at the moment is looking, I mean, and it comes within COVID-19, there is a movement to let's build back better. And so one of the things I've been asked to do by one of the development agencies is to look at what might that mean in microcredit terms. Well, what it might mean is that instead of bailing out these microcredit institutions, and a lot of them are huge and have been making money for years, why don't we say, look, we're going to give you some money, but we're going to, for example, take your equity and convert it into debt, and then we are going to restructure this MFI into a community-owned institution. Maybe it's a financial cooperative, maybe it's a credit union, maybe it's a community development bank, maybe it's a community investment fund. So there are all sorts of different ways of doing it. But rather than having a replay of what happened in 2008, that the public bailed out the banking system and they went gangbusters and expanded and became even bigger. And there's going to be an even bigger collapse in a few years. We all know that. So maybe it's to say, look, you've done your damage. We're going to at least use some of this bailout funding in order to convert some of you. Now, some of these community-owned institutions, they have great track record. Not all of them work. That's fine, but I think they have a much better track record than microcredit institutions. So I think as part of this COVID-19 rebuilding, we need to move towards genuine participative democratic institutions and not simply bail out these institutions, microcredit institutions that have been making money like bandits for years now. Now they're in trouble, they get government and international development community handouts, and then a year's time they go back to doing what they've been doing before. There's a different way, and this is getting a lot of support now from all communities, that we've got to, as the OECD says, build back better.
I think what you mentioned, the loans being more expensive than they were prior to the regulation. I think Vince and I both had a chuckle because that's exactly what the South African experience has been. Vince, I'll let you ask your question before I move on to the next point.
Yeah, it's more like a statement, really. And Naeem, you might remember some of the work that we've been doing with Stokvels, with one of the large institutions. Now, a Stokvel is it's some form of savings society, if that's one way to put it to you, Milford. I'm sure you would have come across the name.
Yeah, I've come across them, yeah.
But I think what you're saying makes a lot of sense to me, and it's certainly something that we should consider, because in the South African case, as Naeem mentioned, we regularly, you might have good returns for a short period of time, and then one or two banks fall, and guess who has to bail them out? The taxpayer again. And as you said, it's just a cycle of enriching a narrow elite every time. Their faces might change, but I think your point about maybe changing the ownership structure of these institutions is certainly something we should consider. That's a great idea. I'd love to see how your research evolves on this.
Yep. No, I mean, I've come across the Stokvels, and they are a very community-based organization. Not all of them succeed, but when they do succeed, they are a useful way of providing small-scale loans. They are a way of saving. They can actually make a contribution at the community level. They are not about expanding reckless lending in order to get big, in order to develop the revenues, in order to develop the profits, in order to pad the salaries and bonuses of the people that run it. So I think that's a good That's certainly one of the good models. But I mean, there are lots of similar type Roscas and other type financial corps, as I mentioned. Credit unions in the States and Canada are doing really well because people moved their money out of the big banks. They didn't like their ideology and their riskiness. They moved them into credit unions, which have been a great aspect of building America, North America in particular, in the last 100 years. You know, that sort of source of local finance recycled back within the community, either voluntarily or else they have certain legislation that says, well, you're a good thing for the community, we'll give you certain tax breaks, but you have to recycle most of your profit back into the institution or into your members. I mean, in Italy, I was just reading today, they have a very good legislation that makes sure that financial cooperatives and the cooperative banks are legislated in order to reinvest back in the community if they want certain tax breaks. And that's a fantastic way of making sure that capital generated locally is recycled locally. Yeah, they don't all work, but I think you can see much more success with those types of models than with anything that is in the microcredit area where I can't see any success.
I think you touched on a very good point there. You know, surely there's a better way to alleviate poverty and drive financial inclusion. Why does it have to be in the form of a loan, as an example? And indeed, you know, you've mentioned a couple of, I suppose it boils down to what the real motive is behind it. Is it a profit motive or is it really a developmental motive? Can you perhaps elaborate more on these ideologies being realized without you know, the need for a loan or microcredit type infrastructure? Have you seen where it can work better?
Well, I mean, I've done a lot of, in my career as a consultant, I went across to northern Italy many times to look at what was going on there. And Italy was devastated in '45, and they rebuilt a lot of the economy with the cooperative sector. The banks have fantastic experiences, the credit unions, and they had some development banks at the local or regional level. So what was very interesting, and I was going over there because I was part of what was going on in the Balkans, restructuring, rebuilding after the civil war in Yugoslavia. So they had a very positive experience. I've also, but some people will say, well, that's probably European, it's not applicable to other parts. But if you look at the banks in, say, Latin America, in Brazil, for example, in southern Brazil, some great credit unions, financial cooperatives, which were part of the rebuilding of those parts of Latin America. You see them in other countries. You look at Asia with its models of development banking, China with its urban credit cooperatives and its rural credit cooperatives. That was the whole foundation of China's economic miracle, because they were partly cooperatives, so they had some input from local people who were savers, but they were mainly controlled by local government. But what they did was they only invested in potentially sustainable businesses that wanted to export, that wanted to buy the latest technology to produce what it was that they could produce, and they had a rather nice benefit that they could export through Hong Kong. But that became the source of China's model of targeting scarce finance of the businesses that are most likely to produce an economic impact and a social impact. What we've got today is that somebody in Bangladesh running a microcredit institution wants to get as much money out of the door because their director is saying, if you want your salary and your bonus this year or this week or this month, you have to get me 20 more clients. So they're going out into the communities and they're knocking on doors. They're pulling people in. People say, I can't service it. Yes, you can. Sign here. You know, I mean, the whole incentive structure has been turned upside down. I know this for a fact in South Africa because I was there, you know, when you had all the Marikana massacre, and a part of it was they were selling tons and tons of microcredit to financially vulnerable miners who ended up over their heads. And that was certainly one of the reasons why there was a strike, et cetera, et cetera. I'm sure you know the situation more than I do. But it was caused because The people with the loans were wanting to sell as many as possible to people who perhaps couldn't use them, didn't need them, didn't want them, but they wouldn't be able to earn their own salaries and bonuses if they didn't, or even keep their jobs, if they didn't have 50 new customers a week or whatever. So the incentive structure is completely changed if it's when you make it a for-profit institution. So whether it's you're selling microcredit or subprime mortgages or whatever, you know, the incentive structure, and particularly under deregulated structures as well, which is of course what we've had since the 1970s, it's reckless lending is what's driving forward the microcredit sector, as in other sectors as well.
I think you make some excellent points there. It sounds like you know, an entire discussion we can have on a better framework for actually achieving these goals that the regulators want to, and indeed why the entire endeavor of microfinance was introduced into South Africa. Milford, I think we're out of time. We really do appreciate you coming onto the show, and you know, hopefully we can host you again. Vincent, I don't know if you have any closing comments.
I just wanted to say thanks, and I really appreciate some of the comments and your paradigm in the way you viewed this. You know, I just as a closing comment from my side, I thought was particularly enlightening was, you know, understanding how there was this sort of capitalistic view that you wanted the individual to take responsibility. Somehow I find that in South Africa, that's been married with the complete other side, which is almost a socialist type view. You know, if you take the politics of South Africa, which also wants, you know, to support the poor, and somehow you've got this, you know, the toxic marriage, which has caused problems in the end. You know, I just found that an interesting point to think about. Thanks for that.
No, thank you. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you.
Keep well, Milford. We'll speak again soon.
Okay, now see you guys. Take care.
Cheers.
Keep safe.
Ciao.